Mutation Genesis from the Fempiror Chronicles by George Willson. Chapter 9. A Homecoming Farewell. Beth stood in the room that had been hers for the first 17 years of her life and stared at its appearance. Even though she had not been here for 10 years, it was still her room. Everything was where she had left it the night that David had come through her window and taken her away. Even the blanket for two she had been working on was still in its unfinished state. The wooden needles and yarn rested on her bed attached to the half-completed blanket. The only item missing was the painting she had finished of her and David only the day before he returned and took her away. Her parents had moved, nothing else, but her mother clearly kept the room clean since there was no dust anywhere. One might think the room was lived in but for the empty bed. She could only stare silently at it as the memories of another life flooded over her. Ever since Ulrich had taken her in that night, she had put every thought of Hoggenstown, her parents, her life, and especially David, as far from her mind as possible. She had thrown herself into the Alewo training and way of life thoughtlessly, and placed everything behind her. Everything from the evacuation of Aruftium, to the day crossing to Aram, to the constant moving around in Aram, hiding from the Tepish, was little more than a blur in her head. She had become someone else. She was an Alewo, a warrior with deadly unarmed skill and reflexes. There were few on this planet who could match her because she threw herself into every battle like someone with nothing to live for. Because she felt that she had nothing to live for. And then David showed up again. Seeing him again brought 10 years of repression back to the forefront of her mind. She knew she had to deal with her past, but until they were alone, she did not know how. Now, standing in her room and looking at the life she lost, she wondered if this would help at all. She wanted nothing more at this moment than to crawl into her bed, pull the bedclothes over her head, and hope that in the morning she would wake up from a bad dream. A dream where she had killed with her bare hands and relished each one. In this moment, she was just Beth, a girl from a little town that no one had ever heard of except in stories from other people. She was someone with a past that she had pushed aside for years before it had come crashing down on her out of nowhere. She walked slowly around the room, gently touching the remnants of another life, another girl. She ran her fingers along the rack of children's clothes that she had hoped to use one day when she had children. There were not many of them, but each one had represented a phase of a young life that would never exist now. She choked back tears, careful not to make noise in the quiet house. She was here for a reason more difficult than just seeing her room again. She had to look upon the people who loved her most in this world and tell them goodbye. She had to walk away from them knowing that she would live for hundreds of years after their deaths, and that she would never see them again. She walked out of her room and through her house. The house was virtually identical to how she left it, with one notable exception. Hung above the fireplace in the living room was her picture. They had even left David's face intact. She looked at the happy couple she had conjured into a space neither of them had ever really occupied in that life, and wondered what her parents had really thought when it had all come to light. She would never know now, just as they would never know that it could still happen. She closed her eyes and walked out of the living room and into her parents' bedroom. While the house had remained relatively unchanged, the two people she looked upon now had changed considerably. Her younger parents had been exchanged for two very old and grief-stricken people. White, that had never been there before, streaked her mother's hair. She knew that the grief had made them look old beyond their years. Beth sighed and considered her words carefully. "What can I say to you?" she said aloud, hoping that in their sleep they might hear her words. "I don't want to cause you any more pain than you must have experienced already. And yet, some selfish part of me needs to tell you goodbye, to tell you that I'm doing well, to tell you that I'm alive." Her father, Patrick Carpenter, stirred restlessly, but did not awaken. Beth walked around the bed to her mother's side and knelt beside her. Gently, Beth stroked her mother's hair. Her mother sighed in her sleep. "My dearest mother," she continued, "I can see how my loss has hurt you. Don't mourn for me any longer. Don't shed another tear. You both know how much I love you, and I will miss you forever. But don't worry any more." Beth leaned over and kissed her mother on the cheek. A tear fell from her mother's eye onto the pillow as a smile drifted across her sleeping face. Beth stood and wiped her own tears. She walked to her parents' window and opened it. A chill from the night air blew in. She turned back to look at her parents one last time. Her father stirred again, but this time he opened his eyes and glanced to the open window. The moonlight reflected clearly off Beth's face, and she knew he would recognize her. Part of her had hoped this would happen. "Beth?" her father said, bewildered. She smiled. "Go to sleep, father," she said. "When you wake up tomorrow, be happy again. Smile again. Let the town hear your laughter once more. I'm sure they've missed it these past years. I know I have." Her last words barely came out as the weight of the loss came upon her. She walked across the room and kissed him on the cheek. He only stared at her, his face betraying happiness and confusion. She looked him in the eyes one last time. "This is a very good dream," she said. Tears streaked down his face as he watched her walk to the window and climb out. She pulled the window down behind her, but listened for just a moment as he rolled back over in bed. Then she heard her mother's voice. "Are you well?" her mother asked her father. "Yes," he said. "Everything's fine now." She heard the covers shuffle again, and her mother sighed. "Yes," her mother said. "Yes, it is." Then it was silent again. Beth finally sank to the ground outside her parents' window. She rested her head against the wall and cried. As silently as she could, she cried for everything she had lost and avoided all these years. She had to get away from their window. She ran behind her parents' house and collapsed on the ground. It all came out. Curled into a fetal position behind the western houses of Hogginstown, Beth finally dealt with her loss. And no one heard her.